Commander Zexhai had seen wars that lasted centuries. He had witnessed the glass planets of Kepler Prime after the Vorthan Empire reduced them to crystalline wastelands. He had walked through the bone fields of Terminus where entire species had been ground to dust in the Great Purge. His forearms bore the scars of 100 battles, and his chitin armor told stories of conflicts that would make lesser beings weep. But nothing had prepared him for the humans. The briefing room aboard the Galactic Council's flagship was packed with military leaders from across known space. The holographic display showed a star map with red zones spreading like an infection across several sectors. Zexhai's compound eyes focused on the human delegation sitting quietly in the corner. They looked so ordinary, so fragile. Pink skin stretched over soft bones, no natural armor, no claws, no venomous fangs. Yet every other species in the room gave them a wide berth. Admiral Korath, the Thexian war chief, stood before the assembly. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he gestured toward the display. The red zones pulsed ominously, each one representing a former enemy stronghold that had fallen to human forces in mere weeks. The hegemony thought they understood warfare, Korath began, his three throats producing a harmonious rumble. They had conquered 47 star systems. Their bioweapons had eliminated entire populations. Their fusion cannons could crack planets. They believed themselves invincible. Zexhai remembered the hegemony's reputation. The insectoid race had perfected the art of psychological warfare, using fear as their primary weapon. Their warriors were bred for battle from birth, standing 12 feet tall with razor-sharp mandibles that could slice through titanium. They had never known defeat. The display zoomed in on the Kepler sector where the first human hegemony contact had occurred. What happened next would be discussed in military academies for generations to come, assuming there were any academies left after the humans were done reshaping the galaxy. The humans received the hegemony's standard ultimatum, Korath continued. Surrender your worlds and serve as slaves or watch your species burn. Every other civilization had either submitted immediately or lasted perhaps a few months before capitulation. A Vorthan general shifted uncomfortably in his environmental suit. Even the proud Vorthans, masters of stellar engineering, had eventually bowed to the hegemony after a brutal 20-year campaign that left their homeworld a frozen husk. The humans sent back a single-word response, Korath said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The room fell silent. Even the translators seemed to hesitate before converting the word into various languages. No. Zexhai felt his breathing apparatus wheeze slightly. Such defiance was beyond comprehension. The hegemony commanded fear across 3,000 star systems. Their mere presence in a sector was enough to make entire governments surrender without firing a shot. The human representative, a female called Ambassador Chen, stood slowly. She was unremarkable by galactic standards. No impressive height, no fearsome weapons, no obvious augmentations. When she spoke, her voice was calm and measured, as if she were discussing weather patterns rather than galactic war. We tried to warn them, she said simply. We really did. The display showed the aftermath of the first battle. Where once the hegemony's fortress world of Kethmor had stood, there was now only an asteroid field, not destroyed by conventional weapons, those left recognizable debris. This was something else entirely. The planet had been reduced to component atoms, scattered across space in a pattern that defied physics. Zexhai's veteran instincts screamed warnings his rational mind couldn't process. He had seen planets destroyed before, but this was different. This was methodical, precise. There was an intelligence behind this destruction that operated on principles no other species understood. Around the room, other military leaders were reviewing their own intelligence reports. The Crystalline Collective had provided sensor data from the battle. The Psionic Consortium had contributed mental scans from the few survivors. All the evidence pointed to the same impossible conclusion. The humans hadn't just won the battle. They had rewritten the fundamental rules of warfare itself. 3 months after the Kethmor incident, Zexhai found himself leading a joint reconnaissance mission to the former hegemony border worlds. The Galactic Council needed to understand what they were dealing with, and his experience in xenobiology made him the logical choice to study human warfare patterns. What they discovered defied every principle of military strategy taught in the last 10,000 years. The first anomaly appeared when they reached the hegemony's former mining world of Duraxis. Long-range sensors showed the planet intact, its cities functioning, its population centers active. This made no sense. The hegemony never left conquered worlds operational. They stripped them bare and moved on. When the survey team landed, they found something that would haunt Zexai's dreams for cycles to come. The hegemony warriors were still there, still alive, still manning their posts. But they weren't fighting anymore. They were building. The massive insectoid warriors, creatures that had once torn through enemy lines with their bare claws, were now constructing hospitals. Their bioweapon facilities had been converted to pharmaceutical plants. The torture chambers had become schools where human teachers worked alongside former hegemony executioners to educate young larvae. Lieutenant Vashita, Zexai's aide, approached one of the construction sites with his scanner active. The readings made no sense. According to the energy signatures, massive neural restructuring had taken place throughout the entire population. Not through force or technology, but through something far more disturbing. The humans had convinced them to change. Dr. Miralon, the expedition's psychologist, interviewed several of the former warriors. Her report would later be classified at the highest levels, its contents too dangerous for general distribution. The hegemony soldiers spoke of humans who came not with weapons, but with questions. They asked why the hegemony fought. They wanted to understand the underlying philosophy of conquest. Then they had offered alternatives. The humans showed us efficiency models, explained Warrior Prime Klixa, once the most feared battalion commander in hegemony space. His mandibles, which had once dripped with enemy blood, now carefully manipulated delicate medical instruments. They demonstrated how cooperation yields 347% better resource allocation than subjugation. They provided mathematical proof that our previous methods were wasteful. Zexai felt his chitin plates shift nervously. He had studied human mathematics during his officer training. Their numerical systems were elegant but unremarkable. Yet somehow they had used pure logic to convince a race of natural-born killers to abandon everything their species had stood for. The survey team moved through the planet's former capital. Once a monument to hegemony brutality, the spike towers where enemies had been impaled still stood, but now they served as vertical farms feeding the population. The arena where prisoners fought to death for entertainment had become a center for conflict resolution training. Most disturbing of all, the humans were nowhere to be seen. They had transformed an entire world and then simply left, trusting their former enemies to maintain the changes voluntarily. No occupation force, no monitoring stations, no enforcement mechanisms, just the quiet confidence that their work would endure. Dr. Miralon's final report contained a single recommendation that sent ripples through every military hierarchy in known space. Under no circumstances should any member species attempt to engage humans in prolonged conflict. They do not merely defeat enemies, they transform them into allies. The psychological implications of this capability represent an existential threat to every current power structure in the galaxy. When they returned to the fleet, Admiral Karath requested a private meeting with Zexai. The old warrior's usually steady demeanor had cracked slightly, revealing something Zexai had never seen before in a superior officer: genuine fear. "Commander," Korath said, his three voices speaking in perfect unison, "in your professional opinion, are we looking at an invasion force or something else entirely?" Zexai considered the question carefully. His entire career had been built on understanding enemy motivations, predicting their next moves, preparing counter-strategies. But the humans operated outside every framework he knew. "Sir," he replied slowly, "I don't think they're trying to conquer us at all. I think they're trying to fix us. And that terrifies me more than any weapon they could have built." The emergency council session had been called after reports arrived from 12 different sectors simultaneously. Each report told the same impossible story. Human diplomatic envoys were appearing in the middle of active war zones, and the fighting would simply stop. Zexai studied the tactical displays with growing unease. The Vorthon crystalline border conflict had raged for 2 centuries over mineral rights in the Nexus system. Yesterday, both fleets had been locked in a brutal engagement that was projected to last another 6 months. Today, they were working together to establish a joint mining operation that somehow benefited both species more than exclusive control ever could. "Explain to me how this is possible," demanded General Thisakar of the Mantid Collective. His species had perfected the art of hive mind warfare. coordinating millions of soldiers with perfect precision. The idea that two enemy fleets could suddenly start cooperating violated everything he understood about military psychology. The holographic recordings from the Nexus system showed a single human shuttle approaching the battle zone. The vessel was unarmed, unshielded, and broadcasting on all frequencies. The message was simple, a request for dialogue. Both fleets should have ignored it or destroyed it immediately. Instead, they had agreed to a temporary ceasefire. What happened during the 3-day negotiation period remained classified, but the results spoke for themselves. Two species that had been trying to exterminate each other for generations had suddenly discovered mutual interests they had never known existed. Ambassador Chen addressed the council once again, her demeanor as calm as ever. This time, however, several military leaders noticed details they had missed before. Her posture was too relaxed for someone surrounded by potential enemies. Her breathing pattern showed no signs of stress. Most unnervingly, she made direct eye contact with species whose gaze was considered an act of war in their cultures, and, somehow, they found it comforting rather than threatening. "Honored delegates," she began, "we understand your concerns about our methods. We know our approach to conflict resolution seems unusual by galactic standards. Perhaps it would help if we explained our underlying philosophy." Zexhai leaned forward despite himself. Intelligence reports suggested that understanding human philosophy might be the key to predicting their actions. Every major power in the galaxy had dedicated research teams trying to decode human behavioral patterns. "On our homeworld," Chen continued, "we learned very early that violence is expensive, not just in terms of resources or casualties, but in terms of opportunity cost. Every moment spent fighting is a moment not spent building, exploring, or discovering. We developed our current methods out of pure pragmatism." The display showed Earth's history in compressed time-lapse. Zexhai watched civilizations rise and fall, wars devastate continents, and rebuilding efforts that took centuries. But something strange happened in the later periods. The cycles of destruction began to lengthen. Conflicts became shorter and more decisive. Eventually, large-scale warfare seemed to disappear entirely. "We discovered that most conflicts stem from misunderstood resource allocation problems," Chen explained. "Two groups want the same thing because they haven't realized that cooperation could give them access to something better. Our role isn't to impose peace through force, but to help others see options they couldn't perceive on their own." Fleet Admiral Korath interrupted with a gesture that, in Thexian culture, indicated deep skepticism. "You claim to solve conflicts through conversation, yet entire hegemony fleets have simply vanished. Our intelligence suggests your diplomatic missions are cover for some form of advanced warfare we cannot detect." Chen's expression remained neutral, but Zexhai caught something in her eyes that made his combat instincts flare. Not aggression or deception, but something worse. Disappointment. "Admiral," she said softly, "would you like to know what happened to the hegemony fleets?" The room fell silent. Every intelligence service in the galaxy had been trying to answer that question for months. Entire armadas, some containing thousands of vessels, had simply disappeared from sensor networks without leaving so much as debris fields behind. "They requested reassignment," Chen continued. "When they understood what they could accomplish through cooperation instead of conquest, many chose to join our exploration corps. They're currently mapping uncharted sectors and establishing first contact protocols with newly discovered species. Some of their former commanders have become our most effective peace negotiators." The implications hit Zexhai like a plasma blast to the chest. The humans hadn't destroyed the hegemony fleets. They had recruited them. Convinced warriors who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of destruction to abandon everything they knew and embrace a completely different way of existing. Dr. Hassetel of the Psionic Consortium rose slowly, his mental projectors flickering with barely contained alarm. As a species that could read thoughts directly, the psionics had always relied on their ability to understand enemy motivations. But something about the humans blocked their telepathic abilities entirely. "What are you really?" he asked, his voice carrying overtones of existential dread. "No species develops this level of psychological manipulation naturally. What aren't you telling us about your origins?" For the first time since the meetings began, Ambassador Chen smiled. It was not a threatening expression, but somehow it was the most terrifying thing anyone in the room had ever seen. "We're exactly what we appear to be," she said. "We're just very, very good at learning." Zexai's worst fears were confirmed when the intelligence reports from the Outer Rim arrived. The Devourers, an ancient species that had consumed entire star systems for millennia, had encountered humans 6 weeks ago. The Galactic Council had written off those sectors as lost. Nothing had ever survived contact with the Devourers, except as processed biomass. The humans had somehow convinced them to become vegetarians. The report came from Captain Zilnath of the Survey Corps, one of the few beings crazy enough to venture into Devourer territory. Her ship's long-range sensors had detected massive energy signatures in the former feeding grounds of Sector 7. Expecting to find the aftermath of another planetary consumption, she instead discovered something that challenged her understanding of reality itself. The Devourers were farming, creatures that had spent 50,000 years perfecting the art of consuming living worlds, had constructed vast agricultural complexes in space. Their feeding tentacles, once used to drain the life force from entire ecosystems, now carefully tended to massive hydroponic gardens that stretched across multiple star systems. The biomass they produced exceeded anything they had ever gained from planetary consumption. "The efficiency gains are mathematically impossible," reported Dr. Keksaval, the expedition's xenobiologist. His analysis of Devourer nutritional requirements showed that their new farming methods produced 4,000% more usable energy than their previous feeding patterns. They should have discovered this approach millions of years ago. The calculations aren't even complex, but that wasn't the most disturbing part of the report. The Devourers weren't just farming for themselves. They had established trade relationships with 17 other species, exchanging their agricultural surplus for resources they had never known they needed. Creatures that had existed in perfect isolation since the dawn of recorded time were now participating in a galactic economy. Zexai requested the full psychological profile of the human delegation that had made first contact with the Devourers. What he found made him question everything he thought he knew about negotiation tactics. The humans had arrived in a single transport vessel with no weapons, no shields, and no backup. They had broadcast directly to the Devourer Queen Mind with a simple message: "We have some questions about your energy conversion processes. We think we might be able to help you optimize them." Most species that encountered the Devourers spent their final moments screaming in terror as their life force was slowly extracted. The humans had apparently spent their first meeting conducting a detailed cost-benefit analysis of galactic consumption versus sustainable agriculture. They treated the Devourers like a business consulting client. Dr. Keksaval explained in his report, not as monsters or enemies, but as a species with an inefficient resource management system. They provided detailed projections showing how sustainable methods would yield better long-term results with significantly lower risk factors. The Queen Mind's response had been recorded by the humans and included in their contact report. Zexai listened to the translation with mounting horror. The ancient entity, older than most civilizations, spoke with the tone of a student who had just discovered a fundamental error in their calculations. "We had not considered long-term sustainability models," the Queen Mind had said. "Our consumption patterns were based on inherited instincts rather than rational analysis." The humans demonstrated superior methodologies. "We will implement their recommendations immediately." Within days, the Devourers had begun dismantling their feeding fleets and constructing agricultural infrastructure. The transition was so rapid and complete that monitoring stations initially believed the entire species had suffered some form of collective mental breakdown. Admiral Korath called another emergency session after reviewing the contact reports. His usually composed demeanor had deteriorated significantly over the past few weeks. The humans were systematically dismantling every threat in known space, not through conquest, but through something far more unsettling: education. "They're not fighting wars," Korath announced to the assembled delegates. "They're conducting interventions. Every species they encounter becomes more effective, more prosperous, more stable. They're optimizing the entire galaxy." Fleet Commander Veltar of the Razor Syndicate raised a pointed question that had been troubling military strategists across known space. What happens to cultures that don't want to be optimized? What happens to species that prefer their current way of life, inefficient as it may be? Ambassador Chen's answer would later be quoted in military academies as the most terrifying statement ever recorded in diplomatic history. We've never encountered a species that didn't want to improve once they understood their options, she said simply. The key is making sure they truly understand what's possible. HFY felt his breathing apparatus malfunction slightly as the implications settled in. The humans weren't offering choice at all. They were offering understanding so complete, so compelling, that resistance became literally unthinkable. Any species that fully comprehended human alternatives would voluntarily abandon their previous way of life. The galaxy wasn't being conquered. It was being debugged. And the humans were very, very good at finding errors in existing code. The breaking point came when the humans made contact with the Eternal Empire. HFY had served in 3 different campaigns against the Empire's expansion fleets. They were the oldest continuous civilization in known space, with military traditions dating back over 1 million years. Their warriors were cloned from perfect genetic templates and trained from birth and combat techniques that had been refined across countless generations. Their technology was so advanced that most species couldn't even comprehend how their weapons functioned. The Empire had never negotiated. They didn't conquer worlds. They absorbed them into their eternal structure, turning entire populations into components of their vast military machine. When they decided a sector needed to be pacified, resistance was not just futile but literally impossible to conceive. The human contact team consisted of 3 individuals in a civilian transport that would have been considered obsolete by most spacefaring cultures. They arrived at the Empire's border fortress of Kethval and requested an audience with the Eternal Emperor himself. The request was so absurd that Imperial Command initially assumed it was some form of elaborate suicide ritual from a primitive species, Emperor Vashneth. The Undying had ruled for over 300,000 years. He had overseen the conquest of 40,000 star systems and the integration of over 600 species into his eternal hierarchy. His throne room was built from the compressed remains of enemy fleets, and his crown contained crystallized fragments of destroyed homeworlds. The humans walked into this monument to eternal conquest and politely asked if they could review his operational efficiency. Reports. The security recordings from that meeting were classified at levels, beyond even HFY's clearance, but fragments had leaked through intelligence networks. What they revealed challenged every assumption about power dynamics in the galaxy. The humans had somehow gained access to detailed analyses of Imperial resource allocation, military deployment strategies, and long-term expansion planning. They presented their findings with the calm professionalism of management consultants delivering a quarterly review. According to their calculations, the Empire was operating at roughly 12% efficiency. Your Eternal Majesty, the lead human negotiator had said, we've identified several optimization opportunities in your current expansion model. Would you be interested in hearing our recommendations? What followed was a 3-hour presentation that systematically dismantled every aspect of Imperial strategy. The humans demonstrated how the Empire's policy of absorbing conquered populations actually reduced overall productivity. They showed how fear-based compliance created massive inefficiencies in resource extraction. Most damning of all, they proved mathematically that the Empire's million-year expansion had actually made it weaker than when it started. Your military victories are tactical successes but strategic failures, the human had explained, their tone remaining respectful throughout. Each conquest requires increased resource allocation for occupation and compliance enforcement. You're expanding your territory while diluting your actual power base. The Emperor's response was not recorded, but the results spoke for themselves. Within a week, the Empire had begun implementing human-recommended reforms. Within a month, they had voluntarily dissolved their expansion fleets and started negotiating independence agreements with their client species. The humans hadn't threatened the Empire. They hadn't defeated it in battle. They had simply pointed out that its fundamental approach to existence was mathematically unsound. Dr. Mirlan's psychological analysis of the contact team revealed the true scope of what the galaxy was dealing with. The humans weren't using advanced technology or superior firepower. They were using something far more dangerous: Perfect information processing combined with absolute confidence in their analytical methods. They don't see other species as enemies or allies, Dr. Miralon reported. They see them as systems operating with suboptimal programming. Their entire approach to diplomacy is essentially large-scale technical support. Zexhai found himself reviewing combat footage from his early military career, trying to understand how warfare had functioned before the humans arrived. The old paradigm seemed suddenly primitive. Species fought for resources they could have shared more efficiently. They destroyed infrastructure they could have improved instead. They eliminated potential allies who could have enhanced their capabilities. The humans had somehow evolved beyond the fundamental assumptions that drove galactic conflict. They didn't compete for resources because they could always find ways to create more resources through cooperation. They didn't fight for territory because they could achieve better security through alliance networks. They didn't seek dominance because they had discovered that teaching others to excel produced better results than ruling over mediocrity. Admiral Korath's final briefing contained a recommendation that would reshape military doctrine across known space. All combat forces should avoid engagement with human vessels under any circumstances. Not because they cannot be defeated, but because defeat may not be the worst possible outcome of such an encounter. The humans were offering something more seductive than conquest, the chance to become better at everything. And they were very, very good at making that offer impossible to refuse. As Zexhai reviewed the latest intelligence reports, a chilling thought occurred to him. Every species the humans had encountered had been improved according to human standards of efficiency and cooperation. But what happened to cultures that couldn't be optimized? What happened to ways of life that were incompatible with human models of success? The answer, he feared, was that they simply stopped existing. Not through violence or force, but through voluntary abandonment as their practitioners came to understand better alternatives. The humans weren't conquering the galaxy. They were editing it. The revelation that would change everything came from an unexpected source, the humans themselves. Ambassador Chen had requested a private meeting with the Galactic Council's senior military command. Zexhai found himself included in this select group, his expertise in xenobiology making him valuable for understanding whatever the humans were planning to reveal. As they gathered in the secured briefing chamber, every officer present understood they were about to learn something that would fundamentally alter their perception of the galactic situation. Chen arrived alone, as always, carrying nothing more than a simple datapad. Her demeanor remained calm and professional, but Zexhai's trained eye caught subtle differences in her posture. For the first time since human contact began, she seemed almost hesitant. "Honored delegates," she began. "We believe it's time you understood what you're really dealing with. Not because we want to frighten you, but because you deserve to make informed decisions about your future." The room's atmospheric controls adjusted automatically, as stress pheromones from a dozen different species began to saturate the air. Whatever Chen was about to reveal, their instincts were already warning them it would be significant. "We are not the first human expedition to leave Earth," Chen continued. "We are the fourth." Admiral Korath's three voices spoke in perfect unison, a sign of extreme agitation. "What happened to the first three expeditions?" Chen activated her datapad, and the room's holographic display came to life. The images showed star charts spanning regions of space far beyond current galactic maps, thousands of star systems, each marked with symbols indicating established colonies, trade routes, and alliance networks. The first expedition left Earth approximately 1,200 years ago, Chen explained. They established contact with species in the Andromeda Spiral. The second expedition explored the Magellanic clusters. The third focused on intergalactic void regions where ancient civilizations had developed in isolation. Zexhai felt his chitin plates lock into defensive positions as the implications became clear. The humans hadn't just arrived in their region of space. They had been systematically exploring the entire universe, making contact with civilizations beyond even theoretical reach. Each expedition followed the same protocols, Chen continued. Establish contact, analyze existing systems, identify optimization opportunities, and implement improvements. The results have been comprehensive. The display zoomed out to show the full scope of human influence. Entire galactic clusters had been restructured according to human efficiency models. Species that had existed in isolation for millions of years were now part of vast cooperative networks, spanning impossible distances. The scale was so enormous that even the concept of scale became meaningless. Dr. Hassetel of the Psionic Consortium raised the question that everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. How many civilizations have you contacted? Chen paused before answering, as if calculating numbers that exceeded normal comprehension. Direct contact has been established with approximately 847,000 sapient species across 23 galactic clusters. Indirect influence through allied intermediaries extends to roughly 12 million additional civilizations. The silence that followed was absolute. Every military leader in the room was mentally calculating the implications of those numbers. The humans hadn't just made contact with their local region. They had systematically cataloged and optimized a significant percentage of all intelligent life in the observable universe. Why are you telling us this? Fleet Commander Veltar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because you're different, Chen replied, and for the first time since first contact, she seemed genuinely interested in their response. Every previous civilization we've encountered has followed predictable patterns. They resist initially, analyze our proposals, recognize the logical superiority of our methods, and voluntarily adopt our systems. The transition typically takes between 6 months and 3 years depending on their cognitive complexity. She gestured toward the assembled officers. You've been analyzing our methods for over a year now. You understand the mathematical advantages of our approach. You recognize that our systems produce better outcomes for all participants, yet you haven't begun implementation. Zexai realized with growing horror that they were being studied just as intensively as they had been studying the humans. Every meeting, every intelligence report, every strategic discussion had been monitored and analyzed. The humans knew exactly how each species was responding to their presence. We don't understand your resistance pattern, Chen admitted. Your military leaders clearly recognize the strategic advantages of our alliance networks. Your economists have confirmed the productivity improvements our systems generate. Your scientists have verified the technological benefits of our research-sharing protocols. Yet you continue to maintain independent military commands and separate governmental structures. Admiral Korath stood slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the holographic display. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a lifetime spent preparing for exactly this moment. Because we've seen what happens to cultures that accept your optimization, he said. They become more efficient, more prosperous, more peaceful. But they stop being themselves. They become components in your system rather than independent civilizations. Chen's expression shifted slightly, and Zexai caught a glimpse of something that had been hidden beneath her diplomatic facade. Genuine surprise. You're afraid of improvement, she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact that clearly puzzled her. You prefer inefficiency because you associate it with autonomy. We prefer choice, Korath corrected. Even when our choices are suboptimal. For the first time in recorded galactic history, a human representative had encountered a concept she couldn't immediately optimize. The silence stretched as Chen processed this information, her advanced analytical capabilities apparently struggling with the idea that efficiency might not be the highest possible value. When she finally spoke again, her words would echo through military briefings for generations to come. We'll need to study this phenomenon more carefully. Your approach to existence appears to be based on principles we hadn't previously encountered. This is interesting. Zexai realized that for the first time since contact began, the humans weren't entirely sure what would happen next, and somehow that uncertainty was more terrifying than anything they had demonstrated before. 6 months after the revelation, Zexai received an invitation that changed his understanding of warfare forever. The message came through official diplomatic channels, but its contents were unlike anything in the standard first contact protocols. The humans were requesting permission to establish a cultural preservation zone around the Galactic Council's member species. They wanted to create a region of space where their optimization programs would be suspended indefinitely. We've been discussing your preference for autonomy over efficiency, Ambassador Chen explained during the subsequent negotiations. Our analysis suggests this represents a valuable form of diversity that should be maintained rather than eliminated. The concept of humans voluntarily limiting their own influence was so unprecedented that it required entirely new categories of diplomatic framework. Every previous contact had resulted in systematic integration of the contacted species into human networks. Now they were proposing deliberate separation. Think of it as a control group, Chen continued, her tone carrying what Zexhai had learned to recognize as human amusement. Your civilizations will serve as a baseline for measuring the effectiveness of our improvements elsewhere. Plus, we're curious to see how your approach to existence develops without our interference. Admiral Korath's response was immediate and instinctive. This is a trap. Probably, Chen agreed with startling candor. Everything we do serves multiple purposes, but that doesn't mean the offer isn't genuine. We really are fascinated by your commitment to suboptimal choices. The negotiations lasted for 3 weeks and covered details that would have been incomprehensible just months earlier. The humans would maintain their current trade relationships with council species, but would end all optimization initiatives. They would share basic technologies but wouldn't provide efficiency upgrades. Most importantly, they would not attempt to convert any additional species to their operational models. In exchange, the Council would serve as a living laboratory for alternative approaches to civilization development. Human researchers would be permitted to observe and study Council cultures from a distance, analyzing how societies functioned without their intervention. We want to understand what we might have lost, Chen explained when asked about human motivations. Every species we've encountered has improved according to our metrics, but we're beginning to question whether our metrics capture everything that matters. Dr. Miralon's psychological evaluation of this statement would later be classified as the most important document in galactic intelligence archives. The humans, despite their vast capabilities and universal success, had begun to doubt themselves. They had achieved perfect efficiency across most of the known universe, but they had started to wonder if perfection might be missing something essential. Zexhai found himself assigned to the new Cultural Interface Division, responsible for managing human council interactions within the preservation zone. His first briefing contained information that redefined his understanding of human capabilities. The humans had been deliberately restraining themselves. Since first contact, their actual technological capabilities exceeded anything they had demonstrated by several orders of magnitude. Their fleets could have eliminated every Council military force simultaneously without any member species even detecting the attack. Their economic systems could have rendered Council currencies worthless within hours of first contact, but they had chosen to approach as equals rather than as the vastly superior force they actually represented. Why? Zexhai asked during his first official meeting with the human research team. Dr. Sarah Chen, the ambassador's sister and lead xenosociologist for the preservation project, provided an answer that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Because we learned something important from our previous expeditions, she said. Forced optimization works perfectly. Voluntary optimization works even better. But we had never encountered a species that actively resisted improvement after understanding their alternatives. We needed to study what drove that resistance. The preservation zone became operational 6 months later, encompassing the home systems of all Council member species, plus their major colonies and trade routes. Human vessels continued to pass through regularly, but their crews operated under strict non-interference protocols. The results were immediate and unsettling. Without constant pressure to optimize their systems, Council species began developing in unexpected directions. Military technologies advanced along purely defensive lines rather than focusing on efficiency improvements. Art and culture flourished in ways that served no apparent function beyond aesthetic satisfaction. Some species began exploring philosophical questions that had no practical applications. Most disturbing of all, they seemed happier. Production indices dropped slightly across Council space, but satisfaction metrics increased dramatically. Species that had been stressed by the pressure to keep up with human optimization standards began to relax into their preferred social structures. Wars continued to occur, but they were smaller, more ritualistic, and often ended in festivals rather than conquest. Dr. Sarah Chen's reports became required reading for human leadership across the galaxy. Her analysis suggested that their optimization programs, while mathematically sound, had eliminated forms of meaning that couldn't be quantified. The Council species derive satisfaction from struggle itself, she wrote, not from the achievement of goals but from the process of working toward them. Our efficiency improvements remove that struggle, which apparently removes a significant source of meaning from their existence. Zexai realized, as he reviewed the latest data, that the humans had made a discovery that would influence their approach to every future contact. They had learned that perfection might be self-defeating, that efficiency could eliminate the very qualities that made existence worthwhile. The preservation zone wasn't just protecting council cultures from human optimization. It was protecting the humans from losing something they were only beginning to understand they had never possessed: the ability to find meaning in imperfection. As he watched council species continue to develop along their chosen paths, Zexai understood that the galaxy's most feared military force had become something even more remarkable: a civilization humble enough to preserve what it couldn't comprehend. The humans had conquered the universe through understanding. Now they were learning that some things were more valuable when left unconquered, and that perhaps was the most terrifying lesson of all.